You probably believe a healed empath becomes calmer, softer, endlessly understanding, someone finally at peace with the world. That belief feels compassionate. It also happens to be wrong. Carl Jung warned that what looks like healing on the surface often conceals a far more unsettling transformation underneath, because true healing does not polish the personality. It rearranges it. An empath begins life oriented outward. Their nervous system learns early that survival depends on reading the room, anticipating emotional shifts, absorbing moods before they turn dangerous. This sensitivity is often praised, but Jung would have recognized it as a compensatory adaptation. The psyche develops extraordinary perception where it lacks protection. Empathy, in this sense, is not a gift. It is a strategy formed in response to instability. For a long time, the empath mistakes this strategy for identity. This is who I am, they believe. I feel deeply. I care more than others. But Jung insisted that anything left unconscious will eventually dominate the personality. What governs the unhealed empath is not compassion, but fear. Fear of rupture, fear of abandonment, fear of conflict, fear of standing alone. Healing begins the moment that fear is no longer obeyed. This is where expectations collapse. The empath does not become warmer, they become clearer. Emotional noise no longer floods their inner world. What once overwhelmed them now stops at a newly formed boundary. And boundaries, as Jung understood, are not cruelty. They are the structure of the self. Without them, there is no individuation, only diffusion. At this point, something deeply unsettling happens for those who were accustomed to the empath's endless availability. The person who once absorbed pain without resistance now says no. The one who understood everyone now refuses to explain themselves. The one who soothed others now allows discomfort to exist. To observers, this feels like coldness or arrogance. To the psyche, it is integration taking place. Jung called this the emergence of inner authority, the shift from a personality shaped by the collective to one aligned with the self. The healed empath withdraws psychic energy from roles, rescues, and emotional performances. They stop leaking themselves into others. They stop confusing goodness with self-erasure. Their empathy becomes conscious, selective, and grounded in responsibility rather than compulsion. This is why many people struggle to remain close to a healed empath. The version they loved was the one who needed to be needed, the one who carried emotional weight that was never theirs. When that version dissolves, relationships built on imbalance quietly collapse. If you recognize this pattern unfolding in your own life, pause for a moment and write in the comments the sentence that marks this shift. Empathy without boundaries is not healing. The act of naming it is often the first sign that the transformation has already begun. The healed empath does not become less human. They become more real, less reactive, less predictable, less manipulable. Their presence is no longer porous but grounded. They are no longer defined by what they feel, but by what they choose to engage. Jung would say this is the moment the empath stops being a mirror for the world and becomes a center of gravity within it. And this realization, once seen, cannot be unseen. What most people never anticipate is that healing does not make the empath easier to be around. It makes them harder to control. Once the psyche withdraws its energy from unconscious empathy, a quiet but decisive shift occurs. The empath no longer reacts automatically. They pause, they evaluate, and that pause alone unsettles people who were used to immediate emotional access. Jung understood that empathy, when unconscious, functions like an open circuit. Energy flows outward endlessly, draining the self in the process. Healing closes that circuit. The empath begins to experience something unfamiliar and, at first, disturbing. Emotional neutrality. Not indifference, but the absence of compulsion. They feel without drowning. They see without absorbing, and this creates a psychological distance that others interpret as detachment. But this distance is not withdrawal from humanity, it is withdrawal from fusion. Here lies the great misunderstanding. Society romanticizes the empath as someone endlessly available, endlessly gentle, endlessly understanding. Jung would have called this a collective fantasy, a projection placed on those who learned early to regulate others' emotions in order to survive. When the empath heals, they reclaim the energy that sustained that fantasy. And when that energy disappears, so does the role. This is why healed empaths are often accused of having changed, and they have, but not in the way critics imply. They have not become selfish. They have become sovereign. Their decisions are no longer driven by emotional pressure, guilt, or the need to stabilize others. Instead, they are guided by inner alignment, a sense of what is true rather than what is expected. Jung described this as the painful but necessary separation from the collective. Individuation demands a kind of loneliness, not because the individuated person rejects others, but because they can no longer participate in shared illusions. The healed empath no longer confuses intensity with intimacy, nor chaos with depth. They recognize emotional manipulation instantly, not because they judge it, but because they are no longer resonant with it. This new clarity often provokes conflict. People test boundaries, they push, they provoke, they attempt to resurrect the old version through guilt or accusation. But the healed empath does not argue their transformation. They do not defend it. They simply remain unmoved. Jung believed this was a sign of psychic consolidation, when the self no longer requires validation from the outside. At this stage, empathy itself changes form. It becomes less expressive and more precise. The healed empath can deliver uncomfortable truth without cruelty. They can remain present without rescuing. They can love without dissolving. This is not emotional numbness, it is emotional maturity. And here is the paradox most never grasp. The healed empath feels more deeply than before, but only toward what is real. They are no longer emotionally available to illusion, drama, or unconscious demand. Their sensitivity has not disappeared. It has been disciplined. If you find yourself resonating with this shift, noticing a growing intolerance for emotional noise and feeling less compelled to explain yourself, that is not regression. That is integration. And if this perspective is clarifying something you've sensed but never articulated, take a moment to stay connected. Subscribing is less about following a channel and more about continuing a line of thought that challenges how you see yourself. Jung warned that individuation is irreversible. Once the psyche reorganizes around the self, there is no return to the earlier state of unconscious empathy. The healed empath cannot go back to being endlessly available without experiencing profound inner conflict. Something has been seen, something has been claimed. And what comes next is even more unexpected, because the healed empath does not simply withdraw from emotional chaos. They begin to confront it. Once the empath reaches this stage, the transformation becomes impossible to hide. Not because they announce it, but because their presence alone alters the emotional atmosphere around them. Jung believed that when the self takes the center of the psyche, it exerts a quiet gravity. The healed empath no longer chases harmony. Harmony begins to reorganize itself around them. This is where a subtle fear often emerges, even within the empath themselves. Without constant emotional entanglement, who am I now? For years, identity was built around responsiveness, attunement, and caretaking. Healing dismantles that structure. What remains is not emptiness, but something far more confronting: autonomy. Autonomy, Jung warned, feels dangerous to those conditioned to equate love with availability. The healed empath begins to recognize how often being kind was a disguise for avoiding rejection, how often self-sacrifice functioned as emotional insurance. This recognition is not bitter, but sobering. It forces the psyche to mature. As this awareness deepens, the empath's relationship to conflict changes completely. They no longer seek to smooth over tension. They allow it to exist, trusting that truth can withstand discomfort. This is why healed empaths often appear intimidating. They do not rush to reassure. They do not dilute their perceptions. They let silence do its work. Jung described this capacity as holding the tension of opposites, the ability to remain present without collapsing into one side or the other. The healed empath can witness pain without being consumed by it, disagreement without fragmentation, rejection without self-abandonment. This inner stability is rare, and it disrupts social dynamics built on emotional dependency. Something else shifts as well. The healed empath becomes deeply allergic to inauthenticity. They sense incongruence immediately, not just in others, but in themselves. Any action taken to preserve approval now produces inner friction. The psyche signals misalignment instantly. This makes the healed empath increasingly unwilling to perform roles that no longer reflect who they are becoming. As a result, their life often simplifies. Fewer relationships, clearer commitments, less noise. Jung saw this not as withdrawal, but as refinement. The psyche conserves energy once it no longer needs to defend against unconscious overwhelm. The empath's world becomes smaller, but far more real. This is also the point where many healed empaths feel misunderstood. Others may say they've become distant, intense, or even harsh. But the empath knows something fundamental has changed. They are no longer organized around emotional exchange. They are organized around inner coherence, and with coherence comes a new form of strength. The healed empath does not dominate, persuade, or demand. They influence by presence alone. Their groundedness invites truth. Their silence exposes pretense. Jung would say that at this stage, the empath has integrated their shadow, no longer projecting strength onto others or weakness onto themselves. If you've noticed that you no longer chase closure, explanations, or validation, that you can walk away without resentment, and that your empathy feels quieter but heavier, this is not emotional shutdown. It is psychological adulthood. If this perspective is helping you name what you're experiencing, remain with this line of inquiry. Sometimes subscribing is simply a way of choosing to continue a conversation that your psyche has already begun. The final shift, however, is the most unsettling of all. Because the healed empath does not merely become autonomous or discerning, they become something society rarely prepares us to recognize. What emerges at the final stage of this transformation is not softness, wisdom, or spiritual sweetness. It is something far more difficult to categorize. The healed empath becomes psychologically dangerous, not because they harm, but because they can no longer be unconsciously used. Jung understood that the most destabilizing people in any system are not the aggressive ones, but the individuated ones. Those who no longer play the roles that keep the system emotionally predictable. At this point, the healed empath is no longer organized around empathy itself. Empathy becomes a tool, not an identity. They can turn it on or off without guilt. They can enter another's emotional world without losing their own center. This is where the collective often panics. Because the empath who once absorbed dysfunction now reflects it back with clarity. This is why healed empaths are often described as intense or too much, even when they say very little. Their presence forces others to encounter themselves without mediation. There is no emotional cushioning anymore, no automatic reassurance, no silent agreement to carry what others refuse to face. Jung would say the healed empath has become a mirror again, but this time a conscious one, and conscious mirrors are unsettling. The healed empath does not argue, justify, or defend their boundaries. They do not need to. Their nervous system is no longer entangled with external approval. This creates a kind of psychological independence that many mistake for detachment. In reality, it is freedom from emotional coercion. They are no longer moved by guilt, urgency, or the unspoken demand to fix what is not theirs. At this stage, compassion becomes quieter and more severe. The healed empath may walk away from suffering that once would have consumed them, not out of indifference, but out of respect for reality. Jung believed that true compassion sometimes looks like refusal. Refusal to interfere, refusal to rescue, refusal to participate in patterns that prevent growth. This is the final reversal of expectation. Healing does not make the empath endlessly available. It makes them ethically selective. They invest where there is reciprocity, responsibility, and consciousness. Where there is none, they withdraw without drama. The old compulsion to stay dissolves, and something profound replaces it: inner authority. The healed empath becomes someone who can stand alone without becoming hardened, who can feel deeply without becoming porous, who can love without disappearing. They are no longer defined by how much they can endure. They are defined by what they choose to engage. Jung would say they have shifted from being governed by the complex to being anchored in the self. This is why the healed empath often feels older than their years, less reactive, less impressed, less seduced by emotional intensity. They recognize that depth is not loud, and truth does not beg to be understood. Their life becomes an expression of alignment rather than sacrifice. If you followed this progression and felt an unsettling sense of recognition, that is not coincidence. It may be a sign that something in you has already crossed a threshold. And if you want to continue exploring these psychological shifts, not as motivation, but as understanding, staying connected here is a simple way to remain in that inquiry. Because once you see what a healed empath truly becomes, it's impossible to return to who you thought you were.